The Sega 32X is an interesting system. In many ways, it's a console in and of itself. It's got its own CPU, two of them in fact, its own GPU, its own memory, power supply, cartridge slot. It's almost surprising it wasn't a standalone console. Which is, to be fair, a common criticism against it. I mean, why would you buy an add-on for a 5-year-old console when a new one is right around the corner? Well, from Sega's perspective, by early 1994, they were faced with some potentially stiff competition from some early entries into the 32 and 64-bit generation, the Atari Jaguar and the Panasonic 3DO. Yes, I know both of these are essentially jokes today, but there was no real way for Sega to know that back then. After all, the 3DO was named 1993's Product of the Year by Time magazine. The Genesis' previous add-on, the Sega CD, hadn't done much to strengthen Sega's position in the market, and its successor, the Sega Saturn, wouldn't be rolled out worldwide until late 1995, leaving an almost 2-year gap that the Genesis would have to fight off some, at the time, fairly impressive visuals. Honestly, it does make some sense when framed that way. The 32X's graphics are honestly pretty comparable to the Atari Jaguar, maybe even slightly better. Initial sales were also pretty strong, surpassing Sega's projections and their ability to keep up with demand. Ultimately though, Sega couldn't convince developers to invest in, as Kalinske described, a stopgap measure. Why spend several months and tens of thousands of dollars making a game when in less than a year it'll be rendered obsolete? As such, demand quickly dried up as it became clear there just weren't a lot of compelling games available. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about the hardware, which, as I said, the 32X has a surprising amount of. 32X games can and do leverage the power of the Genesis too, usually for 2D elements like backgrounds, sprites, and menus. My guess is anything they could offload to the Genesis, they figured they may as well to free up processing on the 32X. But this introduced a problem. See, the 32X might have had its own graphics, but if its video output had to be funneled through the Genesis, then it would have been subject to all of the Genesis's limitations. Imagine your shiny new 3D polygons having to look as grainy as Sewer Shark. Conversely, there's no built-in way for the 32X to get a video feed from the Genesis. As a tile-based console, there's no frame buffer or anything that the 32X can grab and utilize, and there was no reason for the Genesis to funnel its video output back through the cartridge slot prior to this, so they introduced a bit of a hack, which you might have heard about before. Essentially, the Genesis AV output now plugs directly into the 32X. The 32X can then merge the Genesis's feed with its own and send that out to your TV. I've started to become kind of fascinated with the 32X hardware. It's like the ultimate bod, but in commercial product form. I mean, just look at this huge red wire. They must have been pressed for time if that's the best way they could have gotten power down there. When I first picked up my 32X, it didn't come with the patch cable, so out of impatience, I tried to build my own out of wires. And I managed to get some pretty interesting effects that I thought I'd document on video. I'll be showing these directly on a CRT because, speaking of strange 32X AV quirks, it apparently uses some kind of non-standard color timing on the composite feed that messes with my RetroTink. Every time I turn it on, it's like I get a different palette. But TVs seem to be fine, so here we go. Never you stream? I do stream! This is Knuckles Chaotix, arguably the flagship game of the 32X. What you're seeing is the opening cutscene as normal, with the Genesis correctly hooked up to the 32X. Now let's see the Genesis on its own, without passing through the 32X. I imagine this would have been a fairly easy mistake for new 32X owners. I mean, it's not necessarily intuitive that after installing an add-on, the video feed now comes from the add-on. Sega CD doesn't do that. You can see that the Genesis is responsible for the backgrounds and this huge track thing during the opening, but everything else is the 32X, and, well, I don't want to be critical here, but could you tell? Does it look like this is being rendered by a console, quote, 40 times faster than the Genesis? Well, let's get the feed from the 32X alone and take a closer look. Whoa, this is pretty trippy. You can see what this is meant to be by comparing with the normal output. Turns out the 32X needs the sync signal from the Genesis, which makes sense, that'd be how it knows when the Genesis has started and finished a frame. Pretty interesting effect though. With the sync connected, we can see exactly which parts are handled by the 32X. Again, a good chunk of it, but not all of it. The game would still be unplayable because basically the whole stage itself is missing. But maybe that's part of the challenge. Anyone want to try a Knuckles Chaotix no Genesis % speedrun? Otherwise, the cable works about how you'd expect. It uses the RGB output from the Genesis, which is the highest quality signal it can get. We can mess around with this by connecting only some of the channels or swapping some of them around like I did here with Doom, but it's fairly standard stuff. The most interesting effect is definitely removing the sync signal. You can see it gradually gets worse. I'm guessing the analog timing remains fairly close for a while until it eventually shifts further and further out of phase. Something I'm curious about is, I thought the 32X would just slap its picture on top of the Genesis, but when we look at Doom, seen here with just the green wire attached, the menu is handled by the Genesis, and clearly sitting on top of the 32X's 3D graphics. I was curious how that would look on its own, and I guess this is how they did it. They basically just poked holes through Doom to get that menu to appear on top. Let's take a look at Virtua Racing. This is definitely more of a showcase for the 32X's power, so it's no surprise that the Genesis is responsible for very little here. As far as I can tell, just the skybox, which I guess is actually just a 2D background. Honestly, while these graphics do look a little primitive today, they did a good job leveraging both the Genesis and 32X to make a nice image. Same with Virtua Fighter. With the 32X on its own, it looks a little more like a tech demo. They're just fighting on this grey, test pattern checkered floor. But with the Genesis' skybox, it looks a little more like a game. Check it out, if I connect only red, it looks like they're fighting in hell. That's kinda cool. I enjoyed seeing the Genesis graphics in all green. It reminded me of those old monochrome monitors from the 80s and made me feel even more like a hacker. Finally, I had to show a CD 32X game. Yes, even the Sega CD can get in on the action and leverage the extra power plugged into the cartridge slot. Only 5 games ever did this though, and they were all FMV games taking advantage of the 32X's improved palette and decoding power. This is Night Trap, which I made a video about before. Until the recent remasters, these were the best these FMVs ever looked. Here we can see the Genesis is responsible for just about everything except the video itself, which does make sense. The HUD is definitely simple enough for the Genesis to handle on its own, and the more processing power the 32X has freed up, in theory, the higher the quality of the FMVs can be. The green really makes me feel like I'm in command, but if you really want to play on hard mode, you play without any HUD at all. Yeah, I've been playing this game for over 10 years, and even I was immediately lost trying to navigate without any of the icons. Also, the game requires you to change a color code every 5 minutes or so, and well, good luck with that. Anyway, I think you get the idea. Sega's hacky yet understandable solution of making a critical connection between the Genesis and 32X external lets us do a lot of goofy stuff. Check it out, I can pull a Fonzie. Ayy. So I just wanted to show you guys something a little interesting about some old tech. Let me know in the comments if you liked it, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye guys.